All right, go ahead, Chair.
Okay. I'd like to go ahead and officially open the Planning Commission meeting of February 28th, 2023. It's 6:02 p.m. and I'd like to read the following notice regarding meetings. This meeting is being conducted utilizing teleconferencing and electronic means consistent with the state of California executive orders regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Live stream and Zoom, which is what we're using, is being utilized for this meeting. In case of technical issues, meetings will be updated to the city website as soon as possible after this meeting. We will be conducting today's meeting in a virtual setting using Zoom. Committee, commission, board, and staff are participating from remote locations, practicing appropriate social distancing. Members of the public may view and listen to the meeting by use of Zoom as noted in the city's website and as noted on the agenda. Members of the public wishing to speak to the commission may do so during public comment or may comment on agenda items during the discussion of each item and must be logged into Zoom. Anyone using abusive, vulgar, offensive, threatening, or harassing language, personal attacks of any kind, or offensive terms that target specific individuals or groups will be muted and removed from the meetings. Please do not abuse this new way to provide public comment. And I think that might be the last time I would read that comment, since the next time we will be going live, if I'm not mistaken.
And Chair Fernandez, it will probably be slightly different because we'll still have remote folks, but yes, it will be certainly, we'll make it briefer.
Sorry, did I lose you there for a sec?
Yep, but you're back.
Okay. And go, yeah, roll call, please.
Thank you. We will start with Commissioner Kelly.
Here.
Commissioner Burns.
Here.
Commissioner Ottinger.
Here.
Vice Chair Fritz.
Here.
And Chair Fernandez.
Here.
We are all present and accounted for.
Okay. Moving on, agenda item number 2, comments from the public on items not on the agenda. This is for items that are not on the tonight's commission agenda, but are related to the responsibilities of the commission. The commission receives any such comments, but under law may not act on them.
Thank you. And I do not see any members of the public, and I don't believe we have received any comments via email either. Sorry, I had to think about that. The CAC, the Climate Action Committee, got a comment not on their agenda today.
Yeah, you got a few committees you're working on. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close item number 2, comments from public on items not on the agenda, and move on to item number 3, statements of conflict of interest from any of the commissioners. Okay, not seeing any. Then moving on to approval of minutes of August. Let's start with the, let's see, August 23rd, 2022, and asking for any changes, additions, or amendments.
I move we approve the minutes of August 23rd, 2022.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay, let's see, 1 second here. I do actually have a change. Sorry about that. I was kind of, I couldn't remember if it was this set of minutes or the next one. This is on page 3. And this was regarding my comments there. And I went back and looked at my notes that I had written down for my comments and noticed that there was some missing information on there. So under, there was a comment regarding what they call overconcentration of alcohol serving venues in the area. And some people even had commented that there was no objection to this particular item, but that more of an overconcentration in that area. And my comments on, according to my notes, I thought I had made, is that it makes more sense to have venues in a concentrated area, in that it allows for better monitoring and availability of food, that the venues can take advantage of economies of scale. And that would be economies of scale, period. It does not mean that we were not concerned about over concentration or over approval of permits for alcohol venues. We will continue to look at each one as they come in for requests for permits and evaluate them on their individual merits.
And I'll still agree with that.
Sounds
I
like
have a
something you still
question.
agree
Is
with.
that-
Okay.
I have a question. So was that part of the record, or are you adding that, Everett?
No, that was part, according to my calculation, those are the notes that I had written down that I was going to say that I said and that were not included on there. So I'm not adding additional comments. Those are comments that I had written down and thought that I had.
I guess my question is, did you just write them down and not say that? And does
No,
that
I wrote them
matter
down.
If that
I
does.
wrote them down. Yeah, I wrote them down and said those comments. And then I went back when I was looking at and I had the same question about myself. Did I just write those down and not make? And I went back to my notes and I did have those specific notes written down specifically to make those comments. So.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure how to handle it because after it came out, if I sent this information to the director, well, it's already out and then we have to, reissue them and so forth. So I figured that this was the best way unless there's another way for future considerations.
So I guess my question still is, if we watch the recording of the meeting, would those sentences be in there? And does that matter if we're approving them after the fact if they weren't in there?
Yeah, I went through and looked at, and I actually tried to write it down as best as I could according to that.
Okay. Then that's fine with me.
Okay, so we did have a motion and a second, so we would need a revised motion to include as amended if Paul, was that you who motioned? Or you?
Yeah, so I'm fine with making the amendments as proposed by Everett.
And I'm fine with seconding that
All right.
amendment.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. If there's any other changes or comments, I'd like to go ahead and call for the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Kelly?
Yes.
Commissioner Burns?
Excuse me, yes.
Commissioner Ottinger?
Yes.
Vice Chair Fritz?
Yes.
And Chair Fernandez?
Yes.
Thank you. Those minutes are approved
Okay.
unanimously.
And now we are moving on to still item number 4, approval of minutes, this time from September 13th, 2022. And I ask if there's any changes or additions to those minutes.
I have some edits.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's quite possible that I opened the public hearing and asked for public comment on multiple occasions, but I'm going to suggest that we strike 2 of them. At the bottom of page 2, item 6A, the third line down from the summary begins, Chair Ottinger open public comment. Let's strike that one. And at the bottom of page 3, item 6B, third line from the summary begins, seeing none, Chair Ottinger open public comment.
Right.
Take out those
Yeah.
other.
I do see there's a couple duplicates there, yeah. Not substitutions, and certainly makes the minutes clearer in terms of the procedure.
Although I might have said that. You just can't tell.
Okay, any other changes to the minutes? All right, looking for a motion to approval.
I move that we approve those minutes with the edits.
Okay, a motion for approval,
I'll second.
and we have a second. And if there's no other further comments, ask for a vote call.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly,
Yes.
Commissioner Burns. Commissioner Burns.
I got that mute button,
Oh.
sorry, yeah.
That's okay. Commissioner Ottinger,
Yes,
Vice Chair Fritz,
Yes,
and Chair Fernandez.
Yes.
Okay, those minutes are also approved unanimously. Thank you very much. I believe that is it for the 2022 minutes.
Okay,
We will
Uh,
have your Valentine's Day minutes for you at your next meeting.
okay, thank you. Moving on, item number 5, public hearing. We have none for this meeting. And moving on to agenda item number 6A, Planning Commission training, and I'll refer back to our planning director, Carrie.
Thank you. And I did want to ask whether or not you wanted to do the training or the update first. It doesn't matter a whole lot to me, but just.
You know what, if I kind of think maybe the update might be appropriate first, with the permission of the rest of the commission, if there's no objections. Okay,
Excellent.
let's go ahead and do that. I think it makes more sense, and then we can move on to the training.
Great, thank you. And Vice Chair Fritz is the subcommittee member for this item. So Paul, certainly, if you have thoughts and want to talk about things, you can either start or I could start and you could go after, either way.
you can go ahead and introduce it now.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
Present it.
Sure. So one of the major projects on the Planning Commission's work plan this year is to develop objective design standards. And those are basically taking our discretionary design standards. Those standards are not applicable to ministerial streamline projects like the SB 35 project. So the Woodmark project on Bodega is the one we've had so far. However, objective design standards are. So for that Woodmark project, the zoning standards, improvement standards, all of those things that are in a municipal code applied. However, we could not apply our design review. So the objective design standards that we're developing will address that. But I think they go a little bit further, in the way we're utilizing them is actually to try to look and be that sort of forward thinking, especially knowing with the adopted housing element where some of our housing policy may be going to, like, for instance, the multifamily zones R6 and R7. We know that we'll be, and Planning Commission and City Council have adopted the housing element stating that we will change the height limit from 30 for market rate from 30 to 35 feet and 3 stories. It's already allowed for that in that zone for affordable housing. So we're actually using this this process not only to develop the objective design standards to address SB 35, but also to look at some of the other design issues and things that we need to address in town. We have also added SB 9 regulations into that. SB 9 is the state law that was adopted, I believe, a year and a couple months ago, went into effect, allowing for a single family residential zone property to be split, and for that to have 2 units on each property, which would be a main home and an ADU would be allowed. So we did decide to use this project to develop those SB 9 subdivision standards as well. I will say we've been talking actually with a consultant about how the adoption process for this, now that we're getting further into it. The SB 9 residential lot splits in the single family zones will actually be an ordinance modification to the subdivision ordinance. So not a ordinance that you all deal with terribly often, but when someone does come in for subdivisions, the city engineer and planning review with that. The objective design standards will be adopted similar to the rest of our design standards by resolution, and would be applicable to those. We have the consultant for this is Opticos. They developed the SB9 toolkit for ABAG, and so they're actually kind of ahead on developing some of that and thinking on some of those things, and the project with us is to customize it to the unique neighborhoods that we have and those forms. And then they've done objective design standards for several communities. They did a large project for Olive Marin. They've been working on them for Campbell and a number of other communities. So the group that is reviewing these and helping the city with that process is a design review subcommittee, which was formed by council a couple of years ago. Most of you probably remember the Exhibit C, standard conditions of approval. That was reviewed and vetted by that committee before coming to Design Review Board, Planning Commission, and City Council for adoption. So it's that same group, which is Vice Chair Fritz from the Planning Commission, Design Review Board members Christine Level and Lars Langberg. And we did have Mayor Patrick Slater until his retirement. The City Council determined that, and we checked in with the board and they were okay with it, that I continue without a council member, given the very technical nature of the committee. And Patrick, of course, was an architect, whereas the current council does not have anyone in that design construction industry. So the project is about a quarter done at this point. We have included in the packet the existing condition analysis, which is really looking at, okay, here's the forms that you have in town in these various different neighborhoods. And it kind of walks through each zone and each, it looks at the types of buildings that are being produced in those. And then we've had, so that's called the existing conditions report. That'll basically be a chapter within the final document. Our next step that we're at right now is, sorry, I can actually share the calendar with this. It's a bit easier to follow along. So that was the first 3 months or so of the project. Staff actually started meeting with the consultants in September, and we kicked off with the design guideline subcommittee in November. And I think we've had 2 or 3 meetings at least with that group. They are now working on a draft of the design guidelines and what those will be based on the existing conditions and a kind of framework, which the design guideline subcommittee has also reviewed and commented on and discussed with them. Once the draft guidelines are developed, there'll be a series of 3 workshops with the design guidelines subcommittee to review, to go through those, guidelines in detail or standards in detail. And then it will, they'll revise it, and then we'll be ready for bringing it to the design the design review board and the planning commission starting this summer sometime. So that's the general process. I won't go into a whole lot of detail about the actual different kind of parts of town. You can certainly read through those, the existing conditions and physical character. Most of you are familiar with it, so it's, kind of how does a urban designer kind of talk about it and discuss that. And I guess with that, I wanted to just kind of turn it over to Paul to talk about the process and any thoughts you have.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually been pretty interesting to see kind of what they've come up with so far in terms of the kind of looking at town and understanding, our existing kind of development characteristics. And they have started looking at how to, define different areas of town in different ways and what kinds of building types would be allowed, and starting to talk about different development standards that would be required. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this comes out. And I'm actually kind of hoping a lot of these ideas that come out of this can be taken beyond the SB 9 and SB 35 types of projects. Because I think a lot of the ideas they're coming up with are just good for any kind of development project. So I'm hoping that once we get through this objective design standards for the SB 9 and SB 35 projects, that we can take a look at how to maybe apply some of the same thinking just to our regular development standards and zoning codes. I think it could be really, it's just a nice, a different way of looking at how our zoning code works right now. And it's in some ways much more kind of intuitive and much more about what kind of form do we want the city to take? You know, what do we want buildings to look like? How big do we want them to be? Do they have a front porch? You know, what's the setback? You know, all these kind of things that we talk about, but it just looks at it in a different way. And I think it would be helpful to look at it that way for other types of projects. And Carrie, I did have so this is the same, report that we saw when we met, because
That you guys signed off on.
Yeah, because I did
So
have
it's
some
sort of the
comments.
progress record.
Yeah, I did have some comments. I think I made most of the comments in that meeting, but I'm not sure I made all the comments. So I don't know if you want me to send maybe those to you offline rather than take up time now, but they're just some kind of edits and things that I noticed.
Oh, yeah, definitely just send them to me offline and we'll get
Yeah.
into the consultant, yeah.
Like I said, I think I did report on some of it, but now looking at it again, like, I'm not sure I made that note last time. I may have seen a few different things. So anyway.
Great, all right, and I will share one of the images that kind of talks about what we're talking about in terms of projects within, projects within any of these zones, so any of the commercial zones and the multifamily residential zones, which the dark brown, that's our higher density zone, the pink kind of mauve colored is R6. And then the orange bits here and a little bit over by Eleanor Avenue and Fannin are R5. And so we are working with them on a couple of fronts that will probably make their way back. Thank you, Kathy. I see your hand. I'll get to it in a second. That will probably I'm hoping as well, Paul, that some of these things will poise us for future work. So one of the things that we have in our housing element was kind of re-looking at the R5 zone as that, still looking at it as a small scale transition zone between multifamily and single family and providing some opportunities. But as most of you know from Vice Chair Fritz and from being on the commission back in 2018 when the zoning map was redone, there were other parcels that were proposed to be R5 at that time, particularly down on Hayden, and I think there were some on Calder near the park, that when we took it to council, and this was right when I started, so I kind of have some memory of this just because it was my introduction to council, they were concerned about someone coming in and consolidating a bunch of the smaller lots, which are providing great opportunities as kind of starter homes and stuff, to build a bigger, multiplex, larger block kind of apartments. And so they did not adopt a number of these parcels into it. And I've talked a little bit with Vice Chair Fritz, but I think there's definitely using this process to say, hey, if you had a maximum lot size and someone wouldn't be able to do that. So let's make sure, even though, these are all pretty much developed, and when we're working with the consultant, we're actually pushing them to say, hey, we want to rezone more potentially. So we want these guidelines to make sure that we would get what we want out of additional properties zoned that way. And I'll stop for a second. Kathy, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a couple of comments on things in general. Should I wait till a later time or just throw them out here?
I just want to talk about a couple more things, and then
Go ahead.
I'll keep my presentation brief. But I did want to let you all know that for the commercial zones and whatnot, our adopted housing element, which I'll give an update on later in terms of the certification process, does call out doing a workforce housing overlay. And one of the things that we're potentially thinking about is we have the downtown commercial core, we have the kind of the south side commercial area around Fircrest Market, and then we have sort of the northern gateway, it's called, and the southern gateway. And we have a lot of, and I know this commission has had a lot of discussion when it's come up for particular projects about single family homes or other multifamily, but residential only within the South Main, where they were traditionally, there's a lot of homes that have been converted to office, and sometimes they want to go back and forth, and being able to provide that flexibility in that area, as well as along the Healdsburg Avenue between downtown and the north side. And of course, one of those properties is the Kathy Austin Healdsburg site that was just reviewed by the commission. And, does it make sense there's to be commercial, or could it be some sort of a flex zone, or how does that play into this workforce housing thing? So planning staff have started to think about that and talk about that with the design guidelines subcommittee. I did submit a grant application to ABAG last week that would fund such a project to do that workforce housing overlay, and also potentially look at sort of on this upper side, the Redwood Marketplace, and what that could look like in terms of a workforce housing component. The city has gotten a lot of comments, both the council and just directly to staff, about vacancies there, and is there anything we can do to revitalize it? And we've had discussions, I've had discussions with the developer, and I think he's very interested in that kind of a thing. As I've discussed with this group, CVS owns the building, but nothing else on that lot. So there's some complexities, but let's see if we can get some grant money to, look at what a mixed use project could look like there, to try to move that along, but also look at what kind of flexibility we should have along in between these kind of nodes of commercial spots, where really the land use really is very mixed. And so it's kind of the value add we're trying to get and discuss with the consultant as we go through the project. And that's it. So Kathy?
Yeah, a couple of things. I was wondering also about the issue of taking traditional small lots and combining them. And I remember many years ago on Florence Avenue, there are some large lots there adjacent to the existing apartment buildings, and the neighbors were really, really upset with taking out some of the small homes on those lots and putting up apartment buildings on an historic residential street. And there was some, a lot of people could understand that, and the citizens won. So I think that could be a really tricky issue, particularly at the end of Florence, where you've got those small lots marked. Any way to protect the historic neighborhoods, I think is really important, unless they're taking the existing house and making it look like another house somehow, but not in a standard apartment building, at least not the way they were built in the 80s and 90s. And my second point was on looking at the design standards on page 11. I thought it was really odd to have that ADA ramp on page 11, upper right, to have an ADA ramp, which obviously looks like it's kind of a temporary situation on this older house as a standard. I wouldn't want a developer to look at that and say, oh yeah, just because we're on a hill, we can just add ramps. I think it's kind of I'm wondering why that.
Thank you, and I do want to assure you. So I'll share that so folks know what you're talking about. So I'm assuming you're talking about this guy here.
Yeah, I mean, it just jumped out. I think there were some other things, and
yeah, and this isn't necessarily so just to be clear, and thank you, Commissioner Anger, this is examples of what's going on in neighborhoods right now, not necessarily what we want to write standards to get more of.
Yeah,
They're just and indeed there are actually some where, do you want the garages to be so prominent? Do you want to get away from that? Is there a way, some places you might be able to do that, some places you might not. And I know as we were going through this, we certainly encourage them to try to put some of the good examples and not just have a bunch of stuff where it was done before our design guidelines, or it didn't go through design review because it was exempt. but it really wouldn't be what we would want. So yeah, that has certainly been part of the conversation.
And another thing that I've always felt with new urbanism, I've spent some time in Denver and then even walking around some of the Santa Rosa neighborhoods. It looks like developers are taking a large building and breaking it up to make it look like individual architectural styles. I call that architecture rather than architectural elements. So it just looks like a mishmash of ideas. I think it's okay to change the color and make some staggering, but I think for some of the affordable apartments or homes, townhouses, if they look like they're part of a contiguous building that has some stature and real structural design, not just architecture, I think it's more appealing than all the little tchotchkes added to break up surfaces. I mean, you've got classic design on traditional homes, and I think you can do that with a large building as well. And I wish that we could show some examples of large buildings. I think there were some later on. I don't know which page it is now. I'm thinking of the houses at the corner of Calder and Main Street. That was a boarding house that looks like a nice big one
Yeah,
unit,
those
but it
are
has
super
lots of
important.
units in it. Those are the kinds of things I think I would be more
Okay.
interested in seeing in some of our new affordable housing. I'm thinking of being in Portland in the Pearl District and seeing those large brick facades. That's one big house, holds a lot of people. And you could add the character of a traditional, wood style home to that and still make it look substantial and elegant without being that much more expensive, I think. I think that's it.
Great, thank you.
So I just had a procedural question. If we're treating this like a normal agenda item, asking questions of staff and then opening public comment and then making comments, or is this a different where we can go ahead and make comments now?
Well, I think because there's no public comment here, you could probably ask for public comment and then just go back to your discussion.
Okay, but I'm just trying to we should limit
Yeah,
this to
yeah,
questions.
it's a regular item.
Got it.
Why don't you just go ahead and ask for
Okay.
comment now, and then you can proceed with,
Okay.
because you can always ask questions as part of
Right.
the discussion too.
Okay, so just to keep it in line, I just want to go ahead and open up for any public comment, or if you have any written
And
public
I will,
comment.
thank you, and I will note that we have not received any comments on this. I will note that this item will be going to the DRB as a report out at some point in the future as well, at one of their next meetings.
Okay, so go ahead and close public comment, bring it back to commission, and now I did have a question and some comments. So I guess this is for both Carrie, you and Paul. Is there something based on our community that you might find to be a real challenge to kind of fit in based on the uniqueness of our community? Because I know a lot of these things are ideally might work for bigger cities, but maybe not for us. But I'm just wondering if there's anything that jumps out that, hey, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge, or something that we might have to be creative about.
You mean in terms of what they're proposing to do, or?
Yeah.
So far, no. I mean, I think they really are looking at Sebastopol, and that's why they did this report, to see all right, what is sort of the basic, kind of existing development patterns in Sebastopol, and how do we kind of build upon what's there? So what they're, we haven't seen their report, what their kind of final recommendations are, but I think the idea is that it will be kind of custom tailored to our kind of existing built environment. They're not going to tell us that we should be building, 12-story buildings downtown, because we don't have 12-story buildings downtown. So they're trying to keep it to the scale of Sebastopol and our neighborhoods, and what they see is, these existing conditions, and then kind of building upon them and kind of making them standards, so that, for example, one of the conditions is, on Main Street, the buildings downtown are all right, generally up against the sidewalk, but we do have places that have big parking lots in front of them. And, that's really not, sort of frowned upon. It's not good kind of urban design practice to put the parking lot in front of the building, especially if you're trying to create sort of a walkable environment. So one of the things I think they'll come back with is, and again, these are for people that come forward with an SB 35 project, that they'll say, you know, you're not allowed to have a parking lot behind the sidewalk. The parking lot has to be behind the building. And so I think, you know, even though we have some of these situations, I think most of us can agree that they're not the most attractive environments. So, but again, I think the idea is that they're going to kind of custom tailor this to our current kind of environment and what we can do kind of moving forward, keeping it with the scale and kind of development patterns we already have. But it's interesting because, like Carrie mentioned, they have developed this kind of toolkit for ABAG for the whole Bay Area. And so that's kind of like, you know, they can kind of customize all, you know, for each different jurisdiction, basically. Take these pieces that work for small towns versus, you know, San Francisco or Oakland or Sunnyvale or whatever, that are much bigger communities, kind of custom tailor the package to fit kind of our small, you know, more rural community.
Right, and so they kind of break things down in that sort of overarching sort of encyclopedia or library of stuff and say, well, yeah, you're not going to have anything that's 6 stories or bigger. You know, you're not going to have any of that stuff. We're not even going to put that in your document because you just don't, you know, you guys don't allow it. It doesn't make sense. It's not going to. I think one of the things that will be interesting to see is, which I think is unique to Sebastopol, to answer that question, Chair, is the you know, there's always topography and heritage trees and sort of the more unique site characteristics. We have an awful lot of irregular lots, kind of a thing. You know, even if you look at where the dry cleaners is, that parcel is for sale by the High Street parking lot, where Hip Pizza and others are in. You know, if you look at the configuration of that lot, you're like, what? So, you know, we certainly, John and I are meeting with them on a weekly, or it's actually, it's been pretty much weekly since the last subcommittee meeting. As they are developing stuff, they have a lot of questions for us. You know, one of them was, hey, you know, it's if we do this, if you really packed it in, it would be like more than what your density allows. But of course, they don't account for the fact that, you know, like for example, one of the questions they had was, well, you know, for our downtown, the downtown core area, they were looking at a mixed use building and they were assuming 500 square foot units. And it was like, well, but this would give you like a lot more density than your general plan allows. I said, well, but not really, because we count 500 square foot as half of a unit, so it would just be fine. And so we're doing that a lot of kind of iteration with them as they develop these. And you will see, actually, we kind of talked about, you know, or per general plan, so you don't want to have to list all of the zoning code stuff in there, but we are definitely going through the different kinds of buildings and the kinds of development we'd like to see. I know one of them, you know, like the cottage court, or and this is what some of the co-housing kind of stuff is, projects look like, where it's, you know, shared common areas with units around a shared courtyard, or there's a few like the Pocket neighborhood, and I think Petaluma has a couple of really good examples of that, where it really is about kind of the shared open space and not just plunking a big building and having your setbacks and your parking lot, you know. So it's we're able to say, hey, we want that more nuanced stuff, and let's try to push people towards those typologies by making it easy to get to do those, especially through an objective process. But again, you know, if you were just wanting to do a project, you could certainly look at those as guidelines, and if you propose something like that, you know, you'd have, even if it's discretionary, you'd have probably a really good experience with the design review board or the planning commission. So that's, yeah, it'll be interesting to see with, like I said, with the uniqueness of the tree policies and the, you know, some of that, the slopes and things like that. So.
Okay, but I guess it sounds like you feel that they've taken enough into consideration. It's workable. It kind of fits in with hopefully some things we want to do. So,
yeah.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I just raised my
Andre?
hand again.
Yeah.
Carrie, would this include, would a multi-unit facility include even, 500 square feet is a half unit? Would that include a bed, a bathroom, a closet, and like a kitchenette area? Would we
I
allow
would say it's,
those
I
with
would,
the other units?
I would say that you can very comfortably do a 1-bedroom apartment, because I lived for probably 5 years in Berkeley in a 1-bedroom apartment, and it had a living room, a bedroom, closets, a kitchen, small kitchen, but a full kitchen, and room for a shelf and a bathroom. So it's, it's certainly a comfortable, small but comfortable space.
Yeah, I lived in.
And if you think about it, those Huntley Square townhomes are about 540 square feet.
Okay, yeah, I lived in 760 with 2 kids, 4 cats, and 2 businesses. So I know what that's like. But so those kinds of units could be mixed in with some larger units, because I know in the city, sometimes it's just those small units.
Yeah, and that's a good point to
Just to
encourage
scatter
that
those in.
kind of a mix. And and I think either, this doesn't dictate the size that developers want to do. Let me be clear on that. It's more about the overall form and massing. The example about downtown was because they were kind of thinking about it more like that. And what they call it a density yield of how many units would this kind of building form potentially produce. So yes, you would have double density at 500 square feet, but the reality is someone might want to actually do half of the number of units and do them 1,000 square feet, have them be 2 bedrooms.
And charge more.
And either way, that would be fine. What we're trying to, they kind of, it's something called kind of more of a form-based code approach, and we're not adopting the code, but it is looking at the forms, for those development standards. So it's more about, I don't know how many apartments are on top of this building. It could be 1, it could be 3, it could be 5. You wouldn't know, just from looking at it, right? It could be 1 per window, and it could be, and I know this is office above, so it's not, but just kind of, if this was residential or CVS, it's 0, but it certainly could be 10 or 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think that again, like they're more they're kind of pushing more this idea of the form and like how big of a building do you want it to be, and not so hung up on the number of units. I mean, that's part of it. But for example, like in the SB9, you're allowed to subdivide a lot into 2 lots, and each lot's allowed to have a duplex. So what this is going to say is like, okay, you can do a duplex, but it has to, it's going to be a maximum of X number of feet wide and X number of feet, so it's going to kind of contain the size of the duplex. It's really kind of about like, what's the resulting size, and it should be of a scale that's going to fit in with the neighborhood. So they're kind of controlling it kind of on that way. I mean, the duplex obviously that's 2 units, so it's controlling the units as well, but it will give like, it could be a side-by-side duplex and it could be like this, or it could be a upstairs, downstairs duplex, and it could look like this, so it just is going to give some different parameters for how to kind of keep the
Right.
scale in line with what we want to see.
Yeah, it's about scale and massing, I think, a lot. And here, Paul, just to kind of reiterate, if you look at some of these, like, so, okay, what if this was another entry, or for this Litchfield Avenue, could it have, that's one side and the other side is a second unit, and you wouldn't know the difference. Or here you could have, if this was split in half and you had another little stair up here to the shared porch or something, the form within the overall neighborhood doesn't change. So you don't get this weird juxtaposition of, oh, they clearly did this through this law and the city had no say in it, and it's really not what we would want. To be more of a, oh yeah, it just happens to be 2 units instead of, or 2 units in an ADU or whatever it is, instead of the one larger house.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually in line with what Paul has, I think you've had some examples along Main Street where it's 4 units, but it's just an old Victorian that's been subdivided at some point.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing. So it's that kind of a thing, except for new construction, how would you do it that way to make sure you still get the scale you want?
Yeah, we noticed in a lot of, is it Genevieve? Off of Litchfield, the new houses came in on the cul-de-sac and we were walking through them and noticed that you could really have a doorway into the garage and the bathroom and what looked like an office or bedroom. You could have a second dwelling unit there already, but it's already, looks like just a house.
Mhm.
Right.
Most of them had multiple masters as well, which seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, and I know the ones on Litchfield are right across the street from me, and there's one that actually has a granny units next to the Habitat for Humanity homes. And it's like one continuous house, but it's split up into different units. And, you know, I think back to the project across the street from Safeway that we were talking about. One of the things that struck me that I liked about it was how they thought about the living space, that if you had a family member that could essentially exist in the one level, and kind of the forethought that, you know, if it was multi-generation or multi-family, that was kind of preset into it. And I think those are the kind of some of the things we want to think about, that, you know, in the future, how can these living arrangements be set up that, you know, it could be one family, or it could be multi-generation, that they have some, you know, privacy of space, you know, some forethought with that. So.
All right. All right.
Okay, we don't need to take any action on this, or you're looking for any
No,
comments?
this is simply a report and receiving your comments. So
Okay,
we're good.
great. All right, I don't know if there's any other questions or comments. If not, I will be moving on and move on to the, do you want to go to the planning director's report and then training and finish up with the training? Do you think that makes sense? Or do you want to do the training and then your report?
It doesn't matter to me. It's up to the chair.
You know, I think it might make sense to, I mean, I know there's no members of the public. I
Do
guess.
do all of our business first.
Yeah, and then I think we can do the training and, you know, finish up with that. You know, unless commissioners think that there's a reason to keep it the way that it is.
Sure, no problem. So let's see, planning director's report. We have, I guess I'll do update on development projects while we're at it. And I'm sorry if I'm repetitive. I give these updates to so many committees and boards. I'm not quite sure if I know who I'm told. And with the change in the order of stuff, it's going to get really confusing, because normally I do planning commission and then the next day I give the same report to the climate action committee. So the Woodmark project is completing their building permit and grading permit work for their phase 1. Phase 1 is 48 units. I know some folks from the public had asked about the traffic study. We did require some revisions to that, and that is uploaded onto the city's website under planning special projects under Woodmark. It has been peer reviewed by Steve Weinberger, the city's main traffic consultant. I think the big change, so it does not warrant a signal, but they will be installing, or the city will be installing, and we'll be helping to pay for a rapid flashing beacon for an improved crosswalk. And of course, they're responsible for all the frontage improvements that would widen the sidewalk and bring it up to ADA and everything like that. The other revision to the project is the main exit at Robinson Road. They will have a stop sign internally for the Woodmark residents exiting, not the Bear Meadows. I think they had it the other way around, and they have graciously proposed to change that. I know that a lot of the folks in Bear Meadows were concerned about evacuation, just given how many numbers were in each using that shared driveway. But that does have appropriate capacity for that. And so, yeah, they are looking at probably starting construction sometime in March, I would say. I think they were hopeful about not getting any more rain this season. I will say, thankfully, we got some rain, even though that might delay the project. We need the rain. So The Hotel Sebastopol likewise will hopefully be starting archaeology in April. They are waiting for some federal approval on the archaeology stuff that's related to their lending. But they already have Sonoma State in contract to do that, and they've already pulled the building permit. They have also signed a contract with the general contractor, so they are lined up, and so we'll be doing construction this summer. I know that will be disruptive to folks, so hang on, but hopefully they'll be able to minimize it since they have a lot of staging across Brown Street where the parking will be, and Brown Street was not they're basically the only people there on Brown Street, so that'll be certainly helpful for that project.
Can I just ask a question on that? Do they intend to, or would it be helpful to kind of let their immediate neighbors in on how they plan to do the construction, just so that they know, and if they need to make adjustments, like the movie theater, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so we will, so as staff, we know that it'll be disruptive, and we've also already kind of let the Barlow know that, they're not going to be able to close, in certain ways. If Brown Street needs to be closed, I think they had requested for the Head West to close up to the movie theater's driveway from council, or from the city. It was appealed to council. The council approved that. But we just received their application for this year's events for Head West, which will be coming to you in one of your upcoming meetings. And they are not proposing to utilize that city right of way at this point. So that is certainly helpful for that and one of those things. But the general process we do as staff with this is to have meetings regarding the construction management. And that includes, like, even with Woodmark, we already talked with them and asked for their construction schedule. When they anticipate doing the work in the road on Bodega, obviously, is certainly critical. And so the same issues will be dealt with the hotel, because we've already asked them for the same information. And as we get closer, we'll meet with them. But like for the Woodmark project, I think they had some utilities stuff into the street 2 weeks before school was out. And I was like, hey, you know what? If it's all the same to you, why don't you bump that a couple of weeks and do it once school is out? Because with Park School right there, it'll be, and so we're trying to coordinate with them to minimize those conflicts. The last community I worked in had way more construction than the town could ever handle, always going on. And so it was actually part of our jobs to do this very proactive construction management. So I'm trying to bring that forward for both the hotel project and the Woodmark project, knowing otherwise they're going to be disruptive and not in a good way. So yeah, we'll be looking at that. I believe they'll be doing the frontage improvements last, towards the end is usually when you do the curb gutter sidewalk, but they do have some things. And I think the main coordination point that we're trying to deal with right now is with Caltrans, because Caltrans is planning on improving the crosswalk at McKinley and 116. So on the northeast side of the plaza. They are, and then we've also been talking with them about the the Weeks Way crossing. Actually, some people have called it in the past a mid-block crossing. It goes right into where the Hotel Sebastopol has an opening as well, but it's really the sidewalk by Weeks Way. And then also the the Depot Street crosswalk, which is actually, because it's so close to the Highway 12 crosswalk, is somewhat of an issue. And so we're already working with the hotel and Caltrans to deal with all of those things, coordination pieces. So yes, it's, I don't have any information on the construction for that yet, because they're still far enough out that we haven't met with their contractor, but we will be doing that. Other updates, the other two larger projects that I have updates on, we do have a proposal from the Barlow to do a hotel the Giyaki building site. You may or may not, I think I may have mentioned that earlier. They would be using the 385 Morris Street cement batch plant site that you guys have done the ES Environmental Scenic Open Space review of. That's their parking lot off of Morris Street proposal. That would be used as the parking for that through valet. All that information, sort of the preliminary information they submitted is on the city's website. If you want more information, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one. In terms of the process for that, they have, the Barlow has asked to go directly to an EIR, environmental impact report, knowing that that was likely. So we did issue an RFP in request for proposals in December. We got the proposals end of January, and we just selected the consultant for that. So we are actually meeting with them this week to do scope out what that is going to look like. We will have a scoping session. It will most likely be at the same time as a regular planning commission meeting. The planning commission will be the main review body for it. I believe they have 6 to 8 conditional use permit elements that they're asking for, along with the environmental analysis and design review, obviously, in the future. So that's a pretty hefty project in terms of the planning commission's responsibilities for review on that. The other project, which you will also be reviewing at some point, is the City Ventures proposed 80+ unit, I'll say 80 units base with potential ADUs added to that, behind O'Reilly at, I forget the address, 1011, I think, Gravenstein Highway North. Again, some of the project information is on the website. There's a lot of information for that project. I don't think we have it all up yet, but we also have a consultant for the EIR for that. That will also have an EIR, and we met with them yesterday, to get them started on scoping that out. And so those are a couple of big projects. I know we haven't had an EIR since I've been here, at least. Don't know whatever history. I know the original O'Reilly building did have an EIR, so that, you know, they aren't unheard of, but these are some pretty large projects in town.
Sure.
To update, and then I think that's it for projects. We do have a couple of, I would say, I'm going to jinx myself if I say they're easy. I will say pretty straightforward use permits that'll be headed your way. Like, one is the renewal of the Head West Marketplace for this next year, and you know, a couple others are just are things that are pretty straightforward, I'll say. And then lastly, I met yesterday with Housing Community Development. They are their deadline for reviewing and certifying our housing element is March 10th, I believe. So we did want to meet with them, just like we did previously, before they submit their comments, so that we don't have to go through a whole new round. Because if we can just correct their comments this week, then they'll take that into account. And so we did meet with them on Monday, and their comments were really just additional information, more clarification, history on something. And so those were actually covered under the council adoption resolution, which allowed staff to make minor edits that weren't substantial. And I just Four Leaf has already written that up, and I reviewed it end of day today, so it'll be submitted tomorrow. So hopefully next Friday or the Monday after, we will get certification of our housing element, which, knock on wood, would make us the first in Sonoma County to have a certified element. That'll be, yes, thank you, something to be happy about, and a whole celebration. And then the hard work begins. And I did let them know actually that your next meeting, which will be the first in-person meeting, March 14th, 6 p.m. at the community center, or the youth annex main room where we used to be. We will actually have Sonoma County Legal Aid talking about tenant right and tenant issues. So I did actually let HCD know, hey, we're already starting to implement this thing. So we're not dragging our feet, we're just charging ahead. And so I think that's it for my report.
I have a couple of questions for Carrie.
Yeah, go ahead.
About the City Ventures.
Yes.
All of a sudden my mind went blank on that. And let's go back to the Woodmark. what is the income level and the demographics for that project? I heard that it was maybe for farm worker housing. Does that mean it has to be 100% farm worker if that's true? And I'm just trying to remember what the details are.
Sure. So the phase one that they're doing right now is 48 units. And that is, and I don't have the exact split. I can get it for you, but it's either very low income or low income. 100% other than the manager's unit. And yes, the first phase is because they have funding through the USDA program for farm workers. That can also be a retired farm worker. It can be someone where one person's a farm worker and the other person works in town, and stuff like that. So it is open. The second phase of it, they don't have committed at this point to anything in particular. So, and that would be the balance of it is 36 units would be the phase two.
Okay, is that because it's phased in? I know that that the Petaluma Avenue apartment, units over there, you couldn't just do a senior project, or you couldn't do a mixed senior and family housing. You had to, you could maybe screen for seniors and try and place them in appropriate units, but that, and I don't know if that was phased in with the big building. Well, I don't remember if it was 3 stories or 4, and versus the townhomes.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think the sort of the target audience of farm workers is because, well, there's a need, but the funding sources that they're getting, one of them is California tax credit allocations, CTAC, which, if you remember back to the affordable housing developers talking about that quite a bit, and the other is for the rental part of it, so for rent subsidies is through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and that's their requirement for that.
I'd be curious to know. I'm sorry, go for it.
I'm sorry, Linda. I was just going to say, I've done a lot of affordable housing projects, and it really comes down to the funding. Sometimes you get a funding source that says oftentimes for senior projects, if you get funding to do a senior project, it has to be only seniors. And sometimes, I've done projects where it's for veterans only. So it just really depends on the money. But I've also done projects that have a set aside for a specific, it's a 80 unit project or whatever, and 20% of them are going to be farm worker because there was a pot of money that someone brought to the table that says, we want to bring this money to you. If we give you this money, we have 20% of your units of for farm workers. So it really depends on how they put it together, and each kind of funding source has its own requirements. So it sounds like this one's going to be a mix but it sounds like they got a pot of money for farm workers, so it's going to be
correct.
A chunk of it
and
for farm
phase
workers.
2, it'll depend upon, and I've reached out to the CEO of the company, to Pacific West Communities to discuss, and I certainly told them, especially with Burbank Heights there, that senior housing would be is certainly a need in the community. Of course, there's a lot of needs in the community, so I think any type that you built, they would come. So.
Well, if we have an opportunity to make suggestions like you did, Carrie, around what our needs are, I'm getting inquiries about if it was just income based or not, and so.
Yeah, and so if you do get that, on our website, we actually have, I'll just bring it up. This is helpful to know. So on the planning department's website, We do, and we're about to get a new website. That's, I guess, my other update for, in about a month or so, but we'll have the same kind of general concept where there's a special projects and notices. If you go through that, here's the City Ventures information, including the prior stuff, if you want to kind of remind yourself, oh, what did I say back when? I will say that they have certainly responded to a number of both the Design Review Board and the Planning Commission comments in their revised proposal. The Healdsburg project that you just reviewed, those links to those are up. Huntley Square Habitat, the hotel. And then we do have for Woodmarks, we actually have the applicants' contact for rental inquiries. And of course, they're not going to be renting it up, until probably late in 2023, looking for that. But if someone wants to be on a list and very low and low income, but if they're interested, they can email, and that email is on our website for people who are interested in potentially renting a unit. So you can direct them to that, Linda, if you want.
Okay, and I'm sure being labeled a farm worker means, is it going to include the cannabis industry as well? And can you remind them?
I don't know what qualification that is. I'm sure I would have them actually contact
FDA,
those
I
folks,
know.
because it's if it's the USDA, I don't know what they would consider, what their qualifications for that are. But I do know I believe it extends to like industry when you're doing production, like in a winery or something. So it may for cannabis as well. It's processing a crop, basically. I don't know.
The pretty large farm worker population and some of them actually would qualify. Well, I don't know if it doesn't have to do with the whole state equity program for cannabis growers, so that the disadvantaged don't, continue to be disadvantaged. So, and who have been prejudiced against. So just putting it in there in the queue in your mind. Now I know what question I was going to ask. It was about the hotel Barlow. From what you know, tear down the old Guayaki building and then build new, or they're going to just repurpose?
That is the proposal. To demolish and building. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And like I said, those drawings are also on the website if anyone wants to take a peek at that. And I'll just note for the record that we did encourage them to do a preliminary review, just like we do everybody, and they declined and did not want to do that. So.
Interesting.
So I will say, if you, those comments that I know we get at prelim reviews, even about, we wish you'd seen this earlier, they were strongly encouraged multiple times to do a preliminary review to get some preliminary input before going forward. They have elected to move forward in the way that they have and with that preliminary review.
Do you know why someone would do that? Is it just because they don't want to bring up more information, or what's your take on that?
I don't know. I did actually relay to them the comments that this commission had when we had our last Planning training course, Planning Commissioner training class, when we had the discussion. And even though I wasn't here for it, a number of you commented on how helpful and good the community process for the Sebastopol Hotel was, or the Hotel Sebastopol. I cannot comment on that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
You feel free to ask them when it does come to you before hearing. No, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Since in your report you also included about our commission meeting in person, I just wanted to ask everyone to consider getting there a little bit earlier. Consider, since we haven't had those kind of meetings, we might have to test out audio equipment or whatever things might be going on. So, we're used to kind of on video, just boom, we're at the last minute getting on, and it seems to work out well. But so to remind everyone, if you can get there, what, a minimum of 15 minutes early, would that be helpful?
I think that would be plenty. There will be a meeting previous to yours. The Climate Action Committee is moving their meetings to, well, everyone is moving their meetings to Tuesdays because that's when the community center has availability. So it will already be, so the mics and stuff I'm not so concerned about. But yes, if you have a laptop that you're planning on bringing, and actually if you could let me know that, that would be helpful, so we can make sure we have power for everybody. I have been looking into the tablet option and talking about that, and we are going to move forward with that, but I may be in touch with some of you to kind of be guinea pigs, where I may get one tablet and sort of have everyone who would be using it, you know, just make sure it works for you before I go buy a whole bank of 5 of them. Like for instance, Commissioner Ottinger had noted to be able to bring a thumb drive, and a lot of tablets don't have thumb drives. So I've been kind of trying to explore and make sure that what we do get, so we may not have it for the first meetings in March. I think, you know, it's a tenant presentation, so hopefully there's not a whole lot of material. In the meantime, if you do want written, printed packets, let us know. And I think we'll, you know, right now our March meetings, other than those potential use permits, aren't too heavy on what would need, you know, heavy on a big stack of like Huntley Square kind of drawings or anything like that. So we'll kind of try to manage that.
And I know that there's probably a certain protocol for commissions or boards that are using electronics to follow, like, you know, not supposed to communicate with each other, you know, using those communication devices and, you know, those types of things. It'd be helpful to kind of be aware of, you know, for that.
Yeah.
I plan to bring I have a laptop and also iPad. I'm not sure which one's going to work better, but I was going to bring both and just try it out and see what, you know, what works. So, but again, you know, I'm thinking, okay, I got to get on the website, and I got, you know, so try to, even if the meeting doesn't start, I could probably do some of those things while the other meeting's going.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the Climate Action Committee meeting will be done by 5:30 at the latest, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so.
All right. But just, you know, just wanted to throw that out there for everyone.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. Thank you. And I did, Commissioner Kelly, they use MERV 8 filters. I have asked if it's possible to swap those out for MERV 13, because I know those are better in terms of the air quality stuff. But I don't have an answer to that question yet.
So there will be provided there, or we bring our own, or whatever the protocol. I guess it's up to each person to decide on that.
For
the meeting, I mean, are we going to, not going to require it, right? People wear masks, but we're going to.
Oh, masks, yes.
That kind of thing, or yeah.
We will make sure we have masks available at the back of the room. Yeah.
All right.
Commissioner Ottinger?
I'm sorry, Carrie, what did you say was the filter?
They've said it's the MERV, MERV 8 filters. And I have asked if they can upgrade to MERV 13 with their existing system, which from my just very limited research is, you know, the higher the number, the better. And that's supposed to be a better level.
Yeah, the filters are good, but also ventilation is very, you know, that's almost the highest goal as you dilute it. And so I don't know if they maintain their HVAC system by cleaning the filters frequently and all that good stuff. You know, I hate to get into their business, but
right,
it is a very, it's, you know, and it's an engineering issue here, or a physics issue, I'll say as well.
Right, and we have, yeah, we are working with that.
And maybe some hand sanitizer as well, just to remind people.
And we'll have
Okay.
Wipes for wiping things down as well.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying that they have the MERV 8 and you're recommending the 13, but that's
I've
not what they
asked
have.
if their system can do that. Yeah, I don't think that's too much to ask. So, and that's a question actually for Dante. So he just got back into town yesterday.
Okay.
So as soon as he sees it, I'm sure he'll respond.
Mhm.
I'm sure he's got like 1,000 emails in his inbox though.
So another question, Carrie, for, I believe I'm the liaison to the city council. And, I, I retired. Don't tell anybody. And, and so I can go, on those Tuesdays, even though I watch everything usually later. But, I'm wondering, is my presence necessary this
So
next meeting?
The March 7th, no. And in fact, I don't actually have any items on it. The March 21st, yes, that is actually when the agenda review has the zoning amendment for the cannabis scheduled. And the way council determined is only the council members and the staff running the meeting have to be, or the actual board members for whatever the
Right.
board is, need to be there. So you can join via Zoom if you'd like to.
Yeah.
But
that
yes,
was
so I would like you at the March 21st, because that's the zoning amendment.
No, and that's the changes that we just did last meeting.
Correct.
Is
Yep.
that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay. All
You might
right.
have, Linda, you might have to wear a name tag. It's been so long since I've seen you.
Yeah, hello.
Looking forward to it. All right.
Yeah, my hair is very, very long, and so we'll see. It's all in a ponytail.
It's just like mine. It's like, who knows? It's just put it up in a bun. It'll be fine.
Kathy, do you have a,
Yeah, I was just going to tell Carrie that I decided to go ahead and buy a laptop. So if you're worried about USB plugs, I mean, probably wouldn't need that. And I'm guessing
Okay,
that
thank you.
laptop I buy will have enough battery power to get through the meeting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a big deal to make sure that they have, and they probably would anyway, but to make sure they have a power strip that people can plug stuff into. So, but
Okay,
yes,
and then-
I know I've done meetings on without being plugged in,
and then
most
Wi-Fi
laptops have 2
access, right?
hours. They will have, yes, they have public Wi-Fi there, so you'd be able to get to the city's website and whatnot. So, yeah. Okay.
Great.
So that is March 14th.
looks like-
And nicely, the council meeting and actually the public art committee meeting will be meeting on the first Tuesday. So that'll be the first, next Tuesday will be the first, hybrid meeting. So they'll at least have those under their belt in terms of that.
and Commissioner Burns, looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Carrie, I just wanted to, you don't need to do this tonight at the meeting, but like, is there an ADA workaround for me for the meeting? And can I have somebody who would volunteer on this committee to maybe talk to me afterwards? Because even if I listen to it again, if people are wearing masks, there might be a lot that I miss. So I guess I can read the minutes, but do they come out on time? Like, I'm just trying to figure out, I'm going to be able to stay at home, right? Without it being.
I don't know. I have not clarified that with the city attorney yet.
Okay.
So,
Well, somebody who, okay. All right. Well, we can
Yeah.
just talk about that later.
yeah, thank you, Debbie, for bringing that back up. I need to get back. I did talk with Larry a little bit about it, but I do know that's still an issue that needs to be resolved.
Gary, could you also, I remember asking about ADA, ADA allowances for attending as well. And so I need to know that. Somehow I
Right, so
just didn't- that-
yes. so
Somehow I think the state would care about that, because if you can't, you can't meet, just like before the pandemic. So I didn't even think there was an opportunity here. So I was going to try it out and see how this works out for me. Okay, just like I
Right.
said before.
Right, and so for a
Um,
physical disability, the accommodation is that a mobility disability, I should say, is that the youth annex is ADA accessible. that is the accommodation, is that it is an AD accessible building.
Well, and
Um,
probably if I spoke sign language, they would have to have an interpreter. Is that correct?
Right, but yes, exactly.
But I
But
don't
that,
speak
I know that's not the case for my
Yeah,
conversation with you. So,
Later on in life, you kind of like, yeah.
yeah, so it's how to do the, something you can read, or the text is, or speech to text, I guess is what it would be. the
Yeah,
other
and
way
it's
around.
too much for my brain to process all right there. And well, anyway, we can talk about this later. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that.
Yeah, I do suspect state will end up changing some things as they kind of realize that it could be a really nice way of being more inclusive if they just thought about it a little bit more.
Like a lot of things.
Unfortunately, I can try it, but I might have to step down if like I just don't know if I can do it. So yeah.
And Debbie, anything I can do to help, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just like even just a question and answer with me the next day. So you'll be like, no, Deb, they didn't say that. They said this, or like, wait,
Yeah.
what did they say?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Don't you remember we volunteered you for this position?
You said yes. Wait, no.
Well, I mean, it's good and bad. Like I never can be on jury duty in my whole life because I don't hear well enough. So they'd be like, what do you mean he's innocent? He had that. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you guys.
Okay. All right.
Oh.
Thank you. Great report as usual. And if there's nothing further on that, then we can go back to item 6A, which is the Planning Commission training.
Excellent. And I will go ahead and get that started. I will hopefully be able to get the sound. Let's try this one. Nope, that's not right one. All right, and actually, Chair, I'm wondering if we could take a 5-minute break while I make sure the technology is set up, and then
That's a good idea. All right,
chance
so
to
it's
get a break.
yeah.
I can-
Can you put the timer on, or is 5 minutes enough?
I think so. Timer. are
Let's
you
just make it.
available to
It's
put 5 minutes on?
7:24, so let's just make it 7:30.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome to Constitutional Limitations on.
All right, so tech support, can you hear that?
Yeah, I heard it.
Planning and Zoning
You
Authority.
can hear that? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Excellent. All right, that means I actually get to go to the loo too. So Kathy, I think you missed it. We just took a 5-minute break. We're going to start up at 7:30. I just realized I needed to make sure the technology was up, so it just
Oh,
made
yeah, I
sense.
just needed to make sure I was okay.
I'm hoping no one can hear this, but Hot Monk is having a Mardi Gras party tonight and they're really rocking. I'm hoping it's not coming through, but it is a little distracting.
That's because they released Pliny the Elder.
Mm.
It's the secret Pliny night. It's
I
crazy.
see.
Full
It
of
is,
Pliny
it is, like I said, it's very rocking in my office right now. It's a little bit distracting. I'm not,
We can't
we're
hear
not
it,
doing
but
it, you have to
thank you.
concentrate a lot.
It's good to know. I guess the real question is, can Linda hear it? But because then I'm gonna get neighbor complaints.
Okay, I will bring this meeting back to order. Are we good to go?
We are, yes. We will start the item.
Welcome to Constitutional Limitations on Planning and Zoning Authority. In order to introduce this topic,
I can
the
hear it, but I
following
can't see it.
topics will be discussed in this course.
I'm sorry, what was that, Paul?
I can hear it, but I can't see it.
Me
You
too.
can-
Yeah.
Oh, that is interesting. Oh.
The song was great, but I don't see anything.
All right. That's weird. Okay.
Limitation.
Can you see it?
Nope.
Zoom changed their settings. Something that's weird. Okay. I'll try this. Can you see it now? Let's see
Yes.
if you can hear
Yeah.
it now.
Can't hear it.
All right. That's what I thought. Okay, there we go. There we go. One more try. Here we go.
Limitations on planning and zoning authority.
Both.
All right.
Yes.
In order to introduce this topic, the following topics will be discussed in this course. What are constitutional limitations? Procedural due process, substantive due process, equal protection, eminent domain, just compensation, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. In previous courses, we reviewed the laws and the sources of laws that affect local planning and zoning. In this course, we will examine the state and U.S. constitutions and their limitations on individual property rights. A number of court decisions are used in the examples in this course. Keep in mind that court cases are occurring every day at the federal and state levels, and that the law of land use planning is constantly changing. Stay informed by contacting your municipal attorney to stay up to date with current statutes and laws that affect your local decision-making. Let's get familiar with some of the important legal principles we'll be discussing by using a hypothetical scenario which includes facts from an actual Michigan Court of Appeals case. Kenzie Development Company bought an 80-acre parcel from Jim and Kathy Dodge and submitted a request to the Planning Commission to rezone the property from agriculture to residential manufactured housing in order to develop a manufactured housing park. During the public hearing, Janet Gibbs, the attorney for Kenzie, said that there was a need for affordable housing in the area, that there are no manufactured housing parks in town, and that there aren't even any areas zoned for that use. Kenzie Development looked at other land, but the area designated for manufactured housing in the master plan has no parcels of sufficient size for sale to make the project economically viable. Besides, nearby roads cannot handle the increased traffic. Gibbs reminded the Planning Commission that in her opinion, they may be illegally excluding manufactured housing. Many concerns were raised by residents and Planning Commission members during the hearing. Larry Bingham, who rents the land for crops, said it's excellent farmland. He is also concerned since his hog farm is upwind. Tom Montgomery, Planning Commission member, added that one of the master plan goals is to protect agricultural land. Mary Rodriguez, Planning Commission chairperson, read a letter from the county sanitarian, which stated that the site has very porous soil and is an important area for groundwater recharge. And since no public water and sewer is available at the site, treatment systems may pollute groundwater supplies. Larry added that there are sinkholes in the area. His tractor got stuck in one a few years ago. Harvey Carter, Planning Commission member, said that he didn't think the schools had the capacity to accommodate many more students, especially since the recent bond proposal was defeated. Kathy Reiner, Planning Commission member, said that there's no need for manufactured housing, especially since the large manufactured housing park just 5 miles south of town is only half filled. Based on discussions in the public hearing, the Planning Commission recommended that the rezoning be denied. The elected board concurred. Kenzie Development sued. Let's briefly discuss the following questions based on this scenario. What legal principles apply to this situation? Let's take a look at a few of these. Presumption of validity. The master plan and the analysis that led to its development are presumed to be valid. It is up to the challenger to prove otherwise. Substantive due process. Reasonable governmental interest. There are several claims that the development will affect traffic, protection of agricultural land, and drinking water supplies. Is it reasonable for government to interfere to protect those values? Generally, the answer would be yes. Exclusionary zoning. Janet Gibbs, exclusionary zoning. Janet Gibbs maintains that there are no areas zoned for manufactured housing parks and no parcels in areas designated for that housing type that are of an economically viable size. There is, however, unused space in a nearby manufactured housing park, though not in town. Generally, zoning cannot have the effect of entirely prohibiting a specific use in the municipality or surrounding areas. But is that the case here? What facts would be important for the court to know to make a decision in this case? The court might need to know more about the zoning practices, ordinances, and plans to determine if manufactured housing is being excluded. Are other areas zoned or used for manufactured housing or higher density uses? Has there been an attempt to zone areas for manufactured housing that cannot support this use? Are utilities available in those areas? What are the soil conditions? Have the goals for agricultural preservation been clearly stated in the master plan? Has the master plan been followed in past decisions? How have similar requests for rezoning been handled? Have specific findings of fact been articulated as the basis for the decision? These are all details that may be necessary to determine if some constitutional rights were denied. Now let's learn more about these important topics.
And just to note, if you substitute general plan for master
Chapter
plan
2.
here, that's-
What are constitutional limitations? The U.S. and state constitutions are the primary source of governmental power. They are also the primary source of limitations placed on that governmental power. These constitutional limitations are critical to how local planning and zoning is exercised. Specifically, the constitutions provide provisions on the use and enjoyment and productivity of an individual's property. The constitutional limitations we will cover include due process, equal protection, eminent domain and takings, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. So how are planning officials empowered? How is it that the Constitution can be a source of government power and also limit government power? This quote from Neil Hamilton, professor of law at Drake University, summarizes this point well. I don't view the discussion as being, are you for private property or for more powerful government? We all enjoy the freedom and economic potential offered by private property, just as we all benefit by a strong government. The issue is, what balance does the Constitution require between individual property rights and society's power to restrict how land is used? Another way to look at the property rights tension is to consider property rights as a bundle of sticks, each stick representing a property right. A strong notion of individual rights means a larger bundle of rights than one held under the opposing view. Public regulation of land use has affected these bundles of rights since the founding of our country.
There is no single list of recognized rights contained in the bundle. The rights constantly change depending on the laws that are passed, court cases that interpret those laws, and state and federal constitutions. For example, every time a court decides a takings case, whether a particular governmental action requires landowner compensation, it defines the content of the bundle by saying you do or do not have the right to do that with your land. Tension about property ownership and property rights is an age-old problem that first reared its head in the United States when the forefathers disagreed about the best use of land. Benjamin Franklin firmly believed in a state role to ensure the use of land for the public good. In 1789, he wrote, "Private property is a creature of society and is subject to the calls of that society whenever its necessities require it, even to the last farthing." However, John Adams espoused the opposite view, that the value of land is in how it can benefit the individual, and as such, strong individual property rights are essential. He said, "Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." It's clear from the perspectives of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams the importance of private property in early debates about the future of the nation. Yet there was never agreement on the appropriate balance. So, who holds the power in land use decisions? While property rights are exclusive, they have never been absolute. Government has always had the power to make an impact on property rights through regulation. This power has long been supported by the common law principles, regulatory police powers, and nuisance law. One of the early cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court over the tension between the state power to regulate private industry that affects the public interest is Munn versus Illinois, decided in 1877. Chief Justice Waite spoke for the majority when he said, "A body politic, as aptly defined in the preamble of the Constitution of Massachusetts, is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good. This does not confer power upon the whole people to control rights which are pure. This does not confer power upon the whole people to control rights which are purely and exclusively private, but it does authorize the establishment of laws requiring each citizen to so conduct himself and so use his own property as not unnecessarily to injure another." This is the very essence of government. Even though the notion of strong property rights was embraced by most participants in the Constitutional Convention, there was and continues to be no universally agreed upon boundary between the rights of the individual and the rights of society. The private property tension may be thought of as a continuum, with strong individual rights on one end and a strong state role in defining property rights on the other.
The second type of due process, and by far the most difficult to understand, is substantive due process. As its name suggests, this due process deals with the substance of the decision. Substantive due process protects against arbitrary governmental action by focusing on the public health, safety, and welfare of actions that local officials make. In other words, it requires that land use regulations serve a legitimate public purpose. The general test applied by the courts to determine whether substantive due process has been violated relate to whether the decision advances a reasonable public interest, such as public health, safety, and welfare, or whether it was an arbitrary and capricious decision. At its core, substantive due process ensures that zoning decisions by a local board are not arbitrary, but instead advance legitimate public interests. The seminal zoning case, Euclid versus Amber Realty Company, sets the standard for how courts review challenges to substantive due process. In this 1926 case, the court states the reasons must be sufficiently related to preclude us from saying, as it must be said before the law can be declared unconstitutional, that such provisions are clearly arbitrary and unreasonable, having no substantial relation to the public health, safety, morals, or general welfare. In short, there needs to be a rational nexus between the regulation and the government decision that is being made. One extreme example would be if an ordinance required that houses be colored purple. What would be the substantive due process rationale for requiring this? Clearly, without reference to public health, safety, and welfare, this would be an arbitrary and capricious regulation that is a violation of substantive due process.
In the Euclid case, the court provided the rationale for zoning in general on substantive due process grounds by stating the exclusion of buildings devoted to business, trade, etc. from residential districts bears a rational relation to the health and safety of the community. Some of the grounds for this conclusion are promotion of the health and security from injury of children and others by separating dwelling houses from territory devoted to trade and industry. Therefore, Euclid legitimized zoning as a constitutional exercise of police powers under the 14th Amendment and substantive due process. The next is for the end of this chapter. Let's discuss an example in which zoning was found to violate a property owner's due process rights as applied to a particular piece of property. Let's discuss an example in which zoning was found to violate a property owner's due process rights as applied to a particular piece of property. Just 2 years after Euclid versus Amber Realty Company, U.S. Supreme Court heard the case of Necto versus the City of Cambridge, decided in 1928. Similar to Euclid, Ohio, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, divided the city into several districts, in this case, residential, business, and unrestricted. Each district identified the kinds of buildings that could be erected. The issue was whether the plaintiff's property, placed in the R3 residential district, deprived the property owner of due process of law under the 14th Amendment. A large auto assembly factory, other industry, and a railroad line lied south and east of the property, which were zoned unrestricted. Property owners argued because industry and railroad uses immediately adjoined lands to the south and east, their property was of little value for the limited uses permitted by the ordinance within the residential district. Residentially zoned property existed to the north and west of the subject property. The R3 district allowed for dwellings, hotels, clubs, churches, schools, philanthropic institutions, greenhouses, and gardening. The R3 district allowed for dwellings, hotels, clubs, churches, schools, philanthropic institutions, greenhouses, and gardening with customary incidental accessories. Drawing on its decision in Euclid, the court reasoned it should not set aside the determination of public officers in such a matter unless it is clear that their action has no foundation in reason that is a mere arbitrary or irrational exercise of power having no substantial relation to the public health, the public morals, the public safety, or public welfare in its proper sense. Drawing on its decision in Euclid, the court reasoned it should not set aside the determination of public officers in such a matter unless it is clear that their action has no foundation in reason and is a mere arbitrary or irrational exercise of power having no substantial relation to the public health, the public morals, the public safety, or public welfare in its proper sense. Also drawing from Euclid, the court warned the governmental power to interfere by zoning regulations with the general rights of the landowner by restricting the character of his use is not unlimited. And other questions aside, such restrictions cannot be imposed if it does not bear a substantial relation to the public health, safety, morals, or general welfare. Applying the facts in this case, the property owners contended that there was no market for residential development on the property in question, and the court held that the action of the zoning authorities comes within the ban of the 14th Amendment and cannot be sustained. Therefore, the zoning violated the plaintiff's due process and did not substantially advance a legitimate public purpose. Both the Euclid and Necto cases were concerned with the character of the surrounding area as well as the subject parcel. These cases highlight the importance of linking sound policy, documentation, and rationale to zoning decisions.
One example of a substantive due process claim often raised by land use litigants is that a rezoning constitutes spot zoning. Generally, spot zoning allegations arise when a particular property owner is afforded a right on a piece of property that is not available to others within the vicinity. Sometimes these are small lots and they're inconsistent with what's in the comprehensive plan. Thus, the argument that substantive due process has been violated because it does not constitute a rational government decision. In determining whether rezoning is a spot zoning, courts look at a variety of factors, including whether the rezoning is consistent with the community's comprehensive plan, whether the rezoning is compatible with surrounding uses, and the likelihood of a harm that rezoning may cause to surrounding properties. In this reading discussion, How to Spot a Spot Zoning, Brad Newman from Michigan State University Extension outlines the key components that are often cited by courts for spot zones. That includes the area is small. In other words, the area that's being rezoned is a small parcel relative to the overall district. It's inconsistent with surrounding uses. For instance, sometimes if a commercial use, such as a repair garage, is allowed in a residential district and no other lots allow for that type of use. A third example would be it confers some type of a special benefit. Again, something that is not allowed within the general zoning district. And it conflicts with the comprehensive plan. So for example, if an area was contemplated to be rezoned, even though it's inconsistent with the current zone, but it's within the comprehensive plan, it may not be considered a spot zone because policy decisions and that nexus that we've talked about earlier relates back to the comprehensive plan. So the zoning ordinance rezoning would be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So here's a knowledge question. What is the single best approach for avoiding substantive due process violations because of spot zoning? The answer is have an adopted master plan and make sure that your decisions are based on that master plan or comprehensive plan. If spot zoning is warranted, make sure it's consistent with that comprehensive plan. Welcome to Chapter 5, Equal Protection. Equal protection guarantees that similar individuals be treated in a similar manner and that no greater burdens are imposed on those individuals than on others. Both the U.S. and state constitutions guarantee equal protection. With respect to zoning, an ordinance may be attacked if it singles out a single individual based on a suspect classification. Suspect classifications include race, religion, national origin, and in some respects, gender. Amendment 14, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution states, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Poverty is not a suspect classification. This means that local issues regarding housing, income, and affordability are not covered by equal protection. However, many communities address these issues through policies and planning.
The U.S. Supreme Court has reviewed racially and economically based exclusionary zoning practices of state and local governments under equal protection claims. From the early 1900s through the 1980s, zoning ordinances were challenged in the courts for furthering racial segregation and using zoning to place a disproportionate number of industrial land uses near African American communities. In addition, while in Euclid, the court endorsed the use of zoning for economic segregation, it also said that there may be cases where the general public interest would be so far outweigh the interest of the municipality that the municipality would not be allowed to stand in the way. In the U.S. Supreme Court case of Village of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, decided in 1976, the court reviewed a rezoning request that was denied by the village to allow a federally subsidized multiple family housing development. The Housing Corporation argued that the village's denial of the zoning request was discriminatory in its intent and effect. Arlington Heights, a suburb of Chicago, experienced rapid growth during the 1960s, and according to the 1970 census, had a population of 64,000 with only 27 Black residents. The case involved a 15-acre site in which 20 two-story buildings and 190 units would be built. However, the plan did not conform to the village's zoning ordinance and required a rezoning to the multiple family housing classification. The submitted materials from the applicant made clear that one requirement to receive federal housing assistance stipulated that the marketing plan be designated to assure that a subsidized development is racially integrated. Some of the comments, both from the opponents and supporters, addressed what was referred to as the social issue, the desirability or undesirability of introducing at this location in Arlington Heights low and moderate income housing that would probably be racially integrated. The Planning Commission and Village Board of Trustees denied the request on planning and zoning grounds, arguing that the area had always been zoned single family and the R5 zoning was intended to serve as a buffer zone to commercial or industrial uses, which did not exist in this area. The issue before the court was whether the village's refusal to rezone discriminates against racial minorities in violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. While the court determined that the village's decision did arguably bear more heavily on racial minorities, the court considered other factors. The village did not have a pattern of discrimination. The area had been zoned R3 since 1959. There wasn't any unusual departures from the standards. The rezoning request progressed according to the usual procedures, including 2 additional hearings, and reviewing the legislative and administrative history. The official minutes focused almost exclusively on the zoning aspects of the application. Therefore, the court held the Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation failed to carry their burden of proving that a discriminatory purpose was a motivating factor in the village's decision. In a footnote within the case, the court clarified proof that the decision by the village was motivated in part by a racially discriminatory purpose would not necessarily have required invalidation of the challenge decision. Such proof would, however, have shifted to the village the burden of establishing that the same decision would have resulted even had the impermissible purpose not been considered.
Welcome to Chapter 6, Eminent Domain and Just Compensation. The U.S. and state constitutions guarantee that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. The purpose of the Takings Clause is to prevent the government from forcing some people to bear alone public burdens that, in all fairness, should be borne by the public as a whole. The premise is that the government has the right to take private property for public use under eminent domain. However, the property owner must be compensated. There are 2 views on what a public use means. There is the narrower view, which constitutes that a public use is something such as a park or a freeway. And then there's the broader view that indicates that the public use is really for a public purpose, let's say to take private property for an industrial park. A 2005 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Kelo versus City of New London, Connecticut, upheld a city's use of eminent domain to execute a redevelopment plan. The Kelo decision does not necessarily mean that eminent domain can be used to advance private development interests. States can use constitutional interpretations or statutory restrictions to preclude the use of private property in the use of eminent domain. Several states have taken this approach following the Kelo decision.
Let's take a closer look at the Supreme Court case of Kelo versus City of New London, decided in 2005, to see how the public use doctrine was applied along with a state-specific case. The City of New London, Connecticut was economically distressed and authorized New London Development Corporation, NLDC, a private nonprofit development entity, to begin purchasing properties or acquiring them through eminent domain for an economic development project. Neighborhood properties would then be transferred to other private companies for a business park to create jobs and investment in accordance with New London's development plan. A number of owners refused to sell, and eminent domain proceedings were brought against them to allow the city to transfer property to a private development company and pharmaceutical company. The primary legal issue was whether the city's condemnation of private properties for the purposes of economic development satisfied the public use requirement of the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that the purpose for the taking was a legitimate public use. The court reviewed whether the city's development plan served a public purpose, noting that the concept had been defined broadly by the court, reflecting a long-standing policy of deference to legislative judgments. The court reviewed whether the city's development plan served a public purpose, noting that the concept had been defined broadly by the court, reflecting a long-standing policy of deference to legislative judgments. The city had carefully formulated an economic development plan that it believes will provide appreciable benefits to the community, including but not limited to new jobs and increased tax base. Promoting economic development was noted as a traditional and long accepted function of government. However, the court emphasized that states could place further restrictions on their exercise of the takings power, therefore narrowing the definition of public use. This Supreme Court decision received considerable national attention, and many states passed legislation or amended their constitutions to further restrict the use of eminent domain from the broadly defined public purpose definition upheld by the court. For example, in one of the leading state cases, Michigan further restricted the use of eminent domain through a Michigan Supreme Court decision and a voter-led initiative. In the Michigan Supreme Court case, County of Wayne versus Hathcock, decided in 2004, the use of eminent domain for an economic development project similar to the Kelo example was significantly limited. In this case, Wayne County wanted to acquire property adjacent to the Detroit Metropolitan Airport for a business park outside of the city of Detroit. Several landowners refused to sell. Wayne County intended to transfer the condemned properties to private properties for development of the project. Wayne County justified its use of condemnation to transfer property to a private entity to achieve the public purposes of economic development. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled that transferring property for a business park did not meet the public use test under the state constitution. This case reversed a 1981 decision by the same court in Poletown Neighborhood Council versus City of Detroit, in which the City of Detroit condemned property to build a GM plant. In Hathcock, the court indicated that condemned property transferred to a private entity could meet the public use test in only one of 3 ways. If public necessity of an extreme sort requires collective action, the property remains subject to public control after transfer, or the reason for choosing the particular property is based on independent significance, that it would serve the public good, such as elimination of blight. In reaction to the Kelo decision, Michigan voters restricted the use of eminent domain even further by a constitutional amendment in 2006. These court and voter reactions highlight the ongoing clash between private property rights on one hand, and on the other, the state's authority to condemn private property for the public good through eminent domain.
Now let's move to a reading discussion on this topic. In the article Eminent Domain from Expert Law, written by Aaron Larson, to recap, eminent domain refers to the power possessed by the state over all property within the state, specifically its power to appropriate property for a public use. Eminent domain law and legal procedures vary sometimes significantly between jurisdictions. Again, while eminent domain law and legal procedures vary sometimes significantly between states, there are several processes that are similar that are followed among the respective states. The government attempts to negotiate the purchase of the property for fair value. If the owner does not wish to sell, the government exercises an action of eminent domain. A hearing is scheduled at which the government must demonstrate that good faith negotiations were underway, but no agreement was reached. If the government is successful in its petition, then fair market value will be appraised on the property. If the government is not successful or the property owner is not satisfied with the decision, either side may issue an appeal to the decision. So in summary, as we've discussed, key components of eminent domain include fair value, just compensation, and public use. Fair value is usually considered to be the fair market value. That is the highest price somebody would pay for the property were it in the hands of a willing seller. Now it's time for a knowledge question. How is just compensation determined? Generally, just compensation is referred to the fair market value as a result of an appraisal done on the property. Just compensation may include more than the price of the property itself. For example, if a business is operating from the condemned property, ordinarily a property owner would be entitled to some compensation for the disruption in the business. Welcome to Chapter 7, Takings. Takings occur when private property is taken for public use without just compensation. Zoning regulations are repeatedly challenged as takings. However, despite the claims by applicants or their attorneys, the vast majority of these local decisions do not rise to the level of a taking. For the tiny minority of decisions that do rise to the level of a taking, compensation is required. How do you know whether a zoning decision would rise to the level of a taking? There are two categorical types of takings that can occur. First, there are physical invasions of the property, which result when governmental actions result in the occupation of the property. An example might be the flooding of an area during a water development project. There are also regulatory takings that may occur when all economic value is removed from a particular piece of property. An example might be when a piece of property is zoned in such a way that no viable uses can be used on that particular piece of property.
Let's discuss the seminal U.S. Supreme Court case, Loretto versus Teleprompter, decided in 1982, that illustrates this issue. This case demonstrates how a regulation can have the same effect as a physical invasion of the property in violation of the Fifth Amendment Takings Clause. Recall that private property is sometimes referred to as a bundle of sticks, with each stick representing a property interest. One of the essential sticks in this bundle is the right to exclude others. In Loretto, a New York state law was enacted that required landlords to permit the installation of cable equipment on their properties. Ms. Loretto did not discover the existence of the cable until after purchasing a 5-story apartment building. She brought a class action lawsuit against Teleprompter alleging that their installations were a taking without just compensation. The issue for the court was whether the regulation invaded the owner's exclusive right of possession, therefore constituting a taking requiring just compensation under the 5th and 14th Amendments. The court held the regulation was a taking and noted, when the character of the government action is a permanent physical occupation of property, our cases uniformly have found a taking, without regard to whether the action achieves an important public benefit or has only minimal economic impact on the owner. The court further explained, the power to exclude has traditionally been considered one of the most treasured strands in an owner's bundle of property rights. In other words, a regulatory taking has taken place when the government requires that another party can enter the property without consent. In other situations, such as zoning applications where officials impose conditions that require property owners to allow the public on their land or the government to take title to a portion of their property, a taking may also occur. This was the issue in the U.S. Supreme Court case Nolan versus California Coastal Commission, decided in 1987. Nolan bought beachfront property under the condition that the original structure could be demolished and replaced with a new residence. When Nolan applied for a permit, the permit was granted on the condition that no one provide a public access easement across the property. The court held that conditioning the building permit on no one to provide a public easement did not advance a legitimate state interest because the state's objectives of banning beachfront development and the easement access did not serve the same purpose. In short, there must be an essential nexus between the condition imposed and the public purpose that is to be achieved.
A number of takings disputes involve exactions, which are conditions or financial obligations imposed on developers to aid the local government in providing public services. In the absence of a categorical taking, the U.S. Supreme Court has relied upon a balancing of three factors outlined in the Penn Central Transportation Company versus New York City case. These three factors include the economic impact of the regulation, the extent to which the regulation interferes with distinct investment-backed expectations, and the character of the government action. In Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York, decided in 1978, the Supreme Court outlined the three-pronged test for regulatory takings, which applies in regulatory takings other than the previously discussed narrow categories of permanent physical invasions under Loretto, or the forced entry exactions under Nolan, or total takings under Lucas. In Penn Central, New York City enacted historic preservation regulations that limited the ability of Grand Central Terminal to build within the airspace above the terminal. The law identified over 400 landmark buildings which were subject to the law. Grand Central Terminal applied for a certificate to allow it to build a 50-story tower over the station and alter the exterior and interior of the terminal. Permission was denied by the Landmark Preservation Commission. Penn Central argued that the landmarks law deprived them of any gainful use in their air rights above the terminal. Therefore, the city had taken their right to the airspace, thus entitling them to just compensation. The court applied its three-pronged test to determine whether a taking had occurred. The court noted that takings law does not divide a single parcel into discrete segments and attempt to determine whether rights in a particular segment have been entirely done away with, and it focuses both on the character of the action and on the nature and extent of the interference with rights in the parcel as a whole. The court held that the landmarks law did not amount to taking of property and noted the restrictions imposed were substantially related to the promotion of the general welfare and not only permit reasonable beneficial use of the landmark site, but also afford opportunities further to enhance not only the terminal site, but also other properties in the vicinity through transfer air rights. The court held that the landmarks law did not amount to taking of property and noted the restrictions imposed were substantially related to the promotion of the general welfare and not only permit reasonable beneficial use of the landmark site, but also afford opportunities further to enhance the terminal as well as other properties in the vicinity through transferable air rights. In the U.S. Supreme Court case Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Commission, decided in 1992, the court reviewed the effects of land use regulations that diminished the value of property under the Fifth Amendment. Lucas bought 2 lots on a barrier island near Charleston with the intent of building a single-family home similar to homes built on adjacent lots. After the purchase of the lots, the state passed the Beachfront Management Act to preserve coastal resources. The regulations prohibited development within a setback line to prevent beach erosion. The act had the effect of prohibiting Lucas from building a structure on his lots, leaving his property nearly worthless without any variance options due to the hardship. The court acknowledged that government hardly could go on if to some extent values incident to property could not be diminished without paying for every such change in the general law. However, the court had long recognized that while property may be regulated to a certain extent, if regulations go too far, it will be recognized as a taking. In this case, the court held that since all economically beneficial or productive options for the land were removed,
Lucas had suffered a taking. The court established the bright line rule that all regulations that deny property owners all economically beneficial use of their property are a taking under the Fifth Amendment.
Significant Supreme Court decisions that have helped to frame the definition of a regulatory taking include the Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Council. The Supreme Court in that case indicated and established that the regulations that leave the owner of land without economically beneficial or productive options for its use go too far. In the Tahoe Sierra Preservation Council versus Tahoe Regional Planning Agency case, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that the loss of all economically viable use must occur for more than a limited period of time in order for a regulatory taking to occur. The primary issue was whether a temporary moratorium in development resulted in a regulatory taking under the Fifth Amendment. Development was halted around Lake Tahoe for 32 months while a regional plan to regulate development was completed. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was directed by California and Nevada to develop environmental standards to address air, water, and soil concerns within the Lake Tahoe Basin to protect the pristine condition of Lake Tahoe. The court held that a taking had not occurred because landowners had not been completely deprived of all economically viable use of their land. The court recognized the planning purposes of interim development controls as an essential tool of successful development to help form a more permanent development strategy. However, the temporary nature of land use regulations could rise to a taking under a particular circumstance after applying the three-pronged test from the Penn Central case noted earlier. Now it's time for a reading discussion. In the article written by Joe Galvin and Kurt Schindler, A Behavioral Approach to Avoiding Regulatory Takings, a number of best practices are identified in this article. Let's review a few of these. A plan or zoning ordinance should be updated when something happens that has not been anticipated, meaning if there's a new use or circumstance that takes place within the community, it may be time to update the plan. Remember that having an adopted plan that fits the current circumstances and a zoning ordinance that is based on that plan is a best management practice. The municipality was sued and lost. Sometimes, as we've discussed in some of these court cases, there are actions that are being taken by the local unit of government that are inconsistent with their adopted regulations or state law. That is a good time for you to be able to update your municipal plan and zoning ordinance. The municipality's attorney, planner, or judge says to do so. Usually, with what we've seen in this course, the fluid nature of many lawsuits, state statutes, and opinions, it is always wise on an annual basis, if not sooner, to be able to update and revise some of your local zoning codes. The other, zoning or plan, is updated. Anytime the zoning ordinance or the plan is updated, it's a good idea to take a look at the plan or the respective zoning ordinance to make sure that they are in sync. And finally, at least every 5 years. Some states mandate a certain period of time of when plans need to be updated. So a general rule of thumb, if it's not mandated sooner, at least every 5 years. Continuing on, other items which we've previously discussed include support your decision by fully articulating your reasons on the record, that findings of fact that have the nexus between your decision and the regulation is key. Train yourself and others who make these land use decisions. Training at the municipal staff level is very important. Watch for conflicts of interest, and when they occur, do not conceal them. Let's discuss a knowledge question. What are the 3 primary ways in which local communities may make decisions that are regulatory takings? By imposing excessive or unrelated exactions, approving actions that are not supported by the ordinance, bending to pressure from interest groups or due process violations, responding to public sentiment rather than following the standards established within the zoning ordinance, or conflicts of interest that arise throughout the process. Here are a few other cases to consider reading to learn more about takings. So how can zoning impact freedom of speech? Freedom of speech in land use decisions is cited in two primary categories. First is in adult entertainment and also in sign regulations, such as billboards. Courts have concluded that regulating the time, place, and manner of speech is valid if it serves a substantial government interest and allows reasonable alternative avenues of communication. For example, in City of Renton versus Playtime Theaters, the U.S. Supreme Court found the city did not use the power to zone as a pretext for suppressing expression. In a more recent example, in the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Reed versus Town of Gilbert, the local sign regulations came under scrutiny, where there were distinctions between directional signs and political signs, and they were viewed to be impermissibly content-based. Let's take a closer look at the Reed case and the facts surrounding the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2015. The primary constitutional issue was whether placing strict limits on temporary directional signs was a content-based free speech violation of the First Amendment. The town of Gilbert, the sixth largest municipality in Arizona, located southeast of Phoenix, had a sign ordinance that prohibited outdoor signs without a permit, but contained 23 exceptions with different display requirements for different non-commercial signs. A church, without a permanent facility, rented property in various locations for its church services, placing temporary signs around town to advertise its services. The town of Gilbert issued citations when its displays violated the time allowed for the temporary signs. The sign ordinance allowed temporary directional signs, defined as signs directing the public to a church or other qualifying event for nonprofit events, to be posted 12 hours prior to a meeting. They had to be removed 1 hour after the event, and their size was limited to 6 square feet, and they could not be placed in the road right-of-way. However, political signs, for example, could be up to 32 square feet, remain for 60 days prior to an election, and up to 15 days post-election. The church posted signs early Saturday bearing the church name and the time and location of the next service, and did not remove the signs until around midday on Sunday. The church was cited for exceeding the time limits for displaying temporary directional signs and for failing to include an event date on the signs. After receiving the citations, Clyde Reed, pastor of the Good News Presbyterian Church, brought the lawsuit. The court held that the sign regulations were invalid as a content-based regulation of speech that did not survive strict scrutiny. Because content-based laws target speech based on its content, they are presumptively unconstitutional and may be justified only if the government proves that they are narrowly tailored to serve compelling state interests. This test was not met. The court noted the sign ordinance defined the categories of temporary, political, and ideological signs on the basis of their messages, and then subjected each category to different restrictions. The restrictions were based entirely on the content. The town argued that the ordinance was necessary to preserve aesthetics and address traffic safety concerns. According to the court, communities have ample opportunities to resolve safety and aesthetic issues for signs with size, building materials, lighting, moving parts, and portability regulations, for example, that are content neutral. This case highlights the need for communities to carefully review their sign ordinances with the municipal attorney to make certain they do not run afoul of the First Amendment and pose a content-based free speech violation. The U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of speech in the First Amendment. State constitutions have similar language upholding freedom of speech. But how can zoning impact freedom of speech? Although the guarantee of freedom of expression is claimed in many land use cases, it is cited primarily in two instances: adult entertainment establishments and signs, often billboards. Chapter 9, Freedom of Religion. The U.S. and state constitutions guarantee freedom of religion. In particular, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states in part, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Zoning ordinances cannot give preferential treatment to certain houses of worship. For instance, Christian churches cannot be given preferential treatment over Jewish temples. Similarly, allowing houses of worship, but not other types of assemblies, violates freedom of religion. The free exercise of religion is also guaranteed. Thus, a regulation cannot burden a particular religious practice. The federal government has furthered the religious freedom guarantees through the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or RLUIPA. Enacted by Congress in 2000, RLUIPA prohibits local governments from applying land use and zoning regulations in ways that substantially burden the religious exercise of individuals or religious institutions. Thus, the Act does not exempt religious institutions from zoning, but it does put limitations on the extent to which local governments can regulate religious uses. Time for a reading discussion. More on the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000. It's important to note that local officials must give careful consideration to any actions that impact religious assemblies or institutions or uses of land for religious purposes. In short, local governments cannot zone religious uses out of their communities.
With the enactment of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, Congress and the President acted on the belief that religious liberty is a constitutional value of the highest order. Local officials and administrators responsible for land use decisions now must give careful consideration to any actions they take that impact religious purposes. Any decision on religious land uses will be subject to close scrutiny by applicants and the courts. RLUIPA was a response by Congress as communities began seeking new ways to limit the impacts of places of worship on neighborhoods and commercial districts. As neighborhood churches have grown over the years to megachurches and expanded activities no longer confined to weekends, these conflicts have been on the rise. Local land use regulations must be careful not to run afoul of the First Amendment and on an individual's right to exercise their religion.
Time for a knowledge question. What two conditions are provided by the RLUIPA that describe when a local government can use zoning to restrict religious land uses? The government must demonstrate that the regulatory burden is in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest and the least restrictive means of furthering that government interest. The following hypothetical case, based on a Michigan Court of Appeals decision, highlights a number of the issues that we have discussed during this course. Let's discuss the activity guidance. Carl McIntosh owns a manufacturing plant that makes wooden shipping pallets. Across the street and adjacent to the Green River is a 4-acre parcel owned by Carl. It used to be vacant, but a year ago, Carl started to store 30-foot-high stacks of pallets on the site. 2 years ago, the parcel was rezoned from industrial to recreational development and open space. The uses permitted by right in the district include private and public parks or recreational facilities that utilize environmental or natural resource conditions as a basis for recreation. This rezoning was enacted after the new comprehensive plan was adopted, which recommended that a portion of the river frontage, including the McIntosh site, be rezoned to RD. One of the key comprehensive plan goals is to increase recreational opportunities for area residents, especially along the river. In a survey conducted prior to the comprehensive plan update, citizens ranked increased recreational opportunities for area residents as one of the most important community needs. The plan also recognized that the community was becoming much more suburban and that industrial uses were declining in the downtown area. Residents, especially those using the river park, complained loudly about the unsightly pallet stacks. Officials told McIntosh to remove the piles since material storage is not permitted in the use in the RD district. Despite repeated requests and official letters, McIntosh refused to move the pallets. As a result, a suit was filed against McIntosh Manufacturing, asking the court to order removal of the pallets and prevent future storage on that site. Carl McIntosh is furious about the whole thing. He feels that the Planning Commission can't rezone individual lots that way when the rest of the area is still mostly industrial. Carl believes this is a case of takings because he can't use the property for his business. The only thing it's good for, he says. Based on what you've learned about constitutional limitations on zoning authority in this course, answer the following questions about this fictitious scenario. How might the court view the rezoning in the context of substantive due process requirements?
Remember that substantive due process relates to the substance of the law and how it advances a substantial government interest. We noted previously that substantive due process must advance that government interest and promote public health, safety, and welfare. Generally, the test applied by the court is whether it fails to advance that legitimate government interest or is an arbitrary or capricious type of regulation. Recall from this case that the new zoning ordinance was adopted after the updated comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan, in essence, led to the change to the zoning ordinance. So there is a nexus or relationship between the policy of the community in the comprehensive plan and the change that was made in the zoning ordinance. With the basis of the regulation outlined in the plan, it is far less likely that the court would view this as an arbitrary or unfounded change for the community. Changes that have been made to the zoning ordinance that are based on the comprehensive plan are less likely to receive scrutiny under substantive due process claims or being arbitrary and capricious because they have a rational basis. In general, zoning changes that are made based on changes to a comprehensive plan are less likely to receive scrutiny from the courts, particularly under substantive due process claims. How might the court view the rezoning in the context of a spot zoning complaint? From the information provided in this case, we know that the McIntosh property was recommended to be rezoned within the comprehensive plan along with other properties along the waterfront. However, based on the facts, we don't know whether other properties were also rezoned in addition to the McIntosh property. Recall from the discussion on spot zoning that if a small parcel in relation to the overall district is rezoned, it may be considered a spot zone. So we would need more facts in this case to determine whether the court would see this as a spot zone. In this case, the court would have the option of returning the case to a lower court to determine this issue. How might the court respond to the takings claim? Carl believes that this is a taking because he cannot use this property for his business. The only thing it's good for, he claims. Generally, a regulatory taking must deny a property owner all viable economic use of the land. In some court cases, over a 90% devaluation in the land still was not considered a regulatory taking. If in fact there are development opportunities related to the new recreational use category within the zoning district for that property, the courts and the community might be able to determine if in fact there are recreational opportunities related to the rezoning of the property. The courts might determine that in fact it was not a regulatory taking because there are other viable uses under the new zoning district.
All right, so you all just got like a whole semester worth of land use law. Any questions?
That's very complicated.
Yes. And actually some of this is interesting. I like the RLUIPA, the religious law, I've not dealt with hardly ever, but then St. Stephen's came to us with the concept of the alcohol use permit cafe, and we had to go through the whole analysis of, well, and it's sort of gone further to say, well, you just can't treat them, you can't grant them rights that they wouldn't otherwise have either in the case of having a commercial cafe there versus the club, which is why they're doing the club license. And so that's, yeah,
Mhm.
you don't come across some of these things all that often, but they touch on them. So.
Yeah, I can see why you would need a semester course for this and not just an hour.
Sure.
Yeah. Nolan Dolan Euclidean geometry, all of this.
I was also thinking that it reminded me of the parking structure in the Barlow, in an open space area building in an area that's so critical to the view shed and access to the Laguna area.
And Kathy, I'm going to stop you just to make sure you don't make any comments outside of a hearing.
Right. It made me think of that.
Okay. Just making sure there wasn't something more to that.
Yeah.
Good catch.
I have a question. If you ever, Carrie, have you ever experienced an eminent domain process?
I have not experienced that process. Most cities or most cities or counties, most governments are very reluctant to do it these days. I do have one instance where it was considered. This was when I was a private consultant doing public planning and architecture for the Walnut Creek Library. It's a very interesting situation where they have sort of called a block that the one across from City Hall, where the boundary is actually the Walnut Creek. It's actually the creek. So and most of the property was, say 3/4 of it is a park, was the city park. And the library was on the other side frontages, and there was actually a landlocked private property parcel, single family home, only accessible through the library parking lot. And we were hired to design their new library, which was much bigger and was gonna, it did get built, but they were at that point, I think they were trying to figure it out, and they just did not, they tried to engage us trying to make a willing seller, but did not go as far as eminent domain. And so to this day, to get to their house, you have to drive through the library parking lot. We had to design it so that it, and we have an underground parking structure there to make sure we weren't cutting off access to their property, which would be a takings.
I know we've had eminent domain ballot measures in the past. I can't remember where those landed, and if California has restricted it in any way. Do you know?
Not that I know of. I'm happy to check, and our city attorney would probably know, or but I don't know. I mean, I think it is still valid. And just if you want a couple of my thoughts on this, one is there was the case law of the New London, where the city of New London eminent domained private property to hand it over to another private property developer. And after that happened, there was some talk, and it was, to me as a planner, it was like, well, I don't personally think that's the right way to go about doing something, because you're, and even though there are places you'd really be tempted to, but isn't kind of the course that I'm following the most, unless it actually truly is for public health, safety, and welfare. To stretch that to economic development from one property owner to another, to me, that's a little bit too far, personally, or professional opinion there. But yeah, I believe it's still possible in California, but cities don't like to do it. People don't like to do it unless necessary, because of the potential litigation of that. And it's just frankly not good PR. Any other thoughts or questions? And of course, this is just sort of an overview, and I think hopefully you start to see where we're drafting draft findings for you so that we do have those findings of fact, and the conditions do need to have a nexus to it. So you can't just, we went through that, I think, a bit with the paella restaurant, where, making sure there was an appropriate nexus. And so you do actually see a lot of this stuff. We don't go into a lot of discussion, but definitely in the future, if you have questions about those, if they're really detailed legal questions, please ask me before the meeting so I can contact the city attorney if I need to.
Well, it makes you appreciate also what we do have in place, and little by little that we've done. We've come long ways from, I just don't want that, I don't like that, to, specifically why, and, so forth. So yeah, since I've been on the commission, have definitely cleared a lot of that stuff up.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Piala case in particular, just because, that was there were so many strong opinions about that, one side or the other. But it's hard to not be influenced by all that. But at the end of the day, we do have a very specific kind of regulatory environment that we're working in, that we need to, make sure that we're keeping that in mind, as well as the public's kind of passions about, for and against specific actions for us to take. We do have, sometimes a very limited, decision to make, really, when it comes down to a lot of things.
Right. I remember Commissioner Burns asking, as part of the public hearing for the Starbucks drive-through use permit, well, is whether or not a Starbucks can go there here or not part of our decision? It's like, well, no, actually, it's one of those areas of town we do allow formal businesses, i.e. we haven't zoned them out of existence. There are places they can go, but we're regulating where those places are. But then no, it's not a basis of decision.
Yeah, because a lot of people, misinterpreted that to say, well, why did you allow, Starbucks to go? We don't need any more. And it's like, well, that wasn't our choice.
Yeah.
The city allows it, not in the shopping center.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending,
Thank
because
you.
it makes my job easier. As you read staff reports in the future, you might see some of these threads coming through in the discussion and analysis by staff.
Makes sense.
It feels like though we got a really early version that hasn't been totally edited, and a lot of the juxtapositions of copy and voice were kind of jarring to keep your mind flowing with the idea. Found it kind of difficult to watch.
Okay.
How many more of these are there?
I just shut that browser. I think there's, I can check. I think there's one more.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
They never end, Paul.
Never stop learning, right?
Yeah.
I bet they could keep going on and on.
Oh, yeah.
You
And
recall-
I attend the classes every year about new legislation updates. So this is
Yeah.
like, housing law, and you've had the housing law trainings in particular. So, yeah.
So in discussions around roundabouts that we've had over the years, certainly this takings issue, enough to where there was an organized attempt to try and stop a potential roundabout across from Furcrest Market, or next to it. It had to do with the Laguna Vista project. And
got it.
yeah, so as those are ones that are pretty easy to know that would happen. But Santa Rosa, when they widened, I think it was Stony Point to the south, and had to do, they did a takings, to widen the road enough to have it, pencil out and do what it needed to do. I think they were trying to put in, was it a 4-lane? I can't recall now, but it was very controversial at the time. Oh,
And they made a lot of mistakes too. They had to redo some of the road part.
oh, really? Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a lot of legal issues around takings. It's the big one. I had part of my property, they did a condemnation, Caltrans did, because they wanted to put in a bigger culvert. And there was no way they were going to say no in any way. And of course, what they gave me as remuneration was very little compared to what I thought it was worth. But you don't get a choice. You take what they give you. So it was not a
Well, that
pleasant
is-
process for not a very big takings, you know?
Debbie?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Commissioners, thank you for being here. I'll see you in person, or most of us, I think,
Or somehow.
on the 14th. So March 14th.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.
Goodbye in the meeting. Thank you.